The slap came so fast that Alara did not even see her mother's hand move. One moment she was standing quietly by the wall, holding a silver tray of drinks for her sister's guests. The next moment her cheek was burning, and the whole room had gone silent. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Every eye in the drawing room turned toward her. "You clumsy, useless girl," said Lady Margaret Voss, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You spilled wine on Lord Harwick's sleeve in front of everyone." Alara pressed a hand to her cheek, though the sting was already fading into something duller, something she had learned to swallow years ago. She looked down at the small wine stain on the gentleman's cuff. It was barely visible. It did not matter. Nothing she did was ever enough, and nothing she did wrong was ever small. "I am sorry, Mother," she said quietly, because saying anything else would only make things worse. Across the room, her younger sister Celeste watched with a faint, satisfied smile hidden behind her fan. Celeste was the reason for tonight's gathering. Her engagement to a wealthy young gentleman named Julian Ashworth was to be announced before the evening ended. Celeste wore a gown of pale blue silk, her hair pinned with pearls, and she looked every inch the beloved daughter of the house. Alara, by contrast, wore a plain gray dress with sleeves too short for her wrists, a dress that had once belonged to a housemaid who no longer worked for the family. It had not always been this way. Alara could still remember a time, faint now like a dream half forgotten, when her father was alive and the house was warm with laughter instead of cold with rules. He had called her his clever girl, had let her sit beside him while he read, had promised her that one day she would find a life far better than the narrow world their family occupied. But he had died when Alara was 12, and with his death, everything gentle in the house had died with him. Lady Voss blamed Alara for his death, though she never said so directly. She hinted at it instead, in cutting remarks about the carriage accident that had taken him, about how he had been rushing home that night because Alara had begged him to return in time for her birthday. It was not true. Alara knew, deep down, that it could not be true. But grief did not care about truth, and her mother's grief had curdled into something bitter that needed somewhere to go. Alara had become the place where it went. "Take the tray to the kitchen," her mother said now, not looking at her, "and do not come back into this room tonight." Alara did not argue. Arguing only made the punishments longer. She carried the tray out of the drawing room, past the guests who avoided her eyes out of either pity or discomfort, and into the corridor, where the noise of the party faded behind her. Her hands were shaking, but she steadied them before she reached the kitchen door. She had learned long ago never to let the staff see her cry. Crying invited questions, and questions sometimes reached her mother's ears, and then there would be more trouble. The kitchen was warm, and smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, a comfort after the coldness of the drawing room. Nora, one of the young housemaids, and the closest thing Alara had to a friend, looked up from the pot she was stirring, and immediately set down her spoon. "What happened to your face?" Nora asked, crossing the room quickly. "It is nothing," Alara said, setting the tray down carefully. "I spilled a drink." Nora's expression darkened. She had worked in the Voss household for 3 years, long enough to understand exactly what nothing meant in this house. "She should not treat you this way. You are her daughter, not her servant." "I am both, it seems," Alara said, trying to make it sound like a joke. It did not come out that way. Nora reached for a cloth and pressed it gently against Alara's cheek, checking for any mark. "One day," she whispered, "someone is going to see how she treats you, and it will not go well for her." Alara wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that the world outside these walls was fair, that cruelty was eventually punished, and kindness eventually rewarded. But 18 years in this house had taught her otherwise. She had watched her mother charm every guest who walked through the front door, watched neighbors praise Lady Voss as a devoted widow, raising 2 daughters alone, watched no one ever guess what happened once the guests went home. From the drawing room, laughter rose again, followed by the clear, delighted voice of Celeste. The engagement announcement, Alara guessed. She should have been happy for her sister. In truth, some small part of her still was. Celeste had not always been unkind, not when they were very young, before their mother had taught her that kindness toward Alara was a weakness to be corrected. But the years had worn away whatever affection once existed between them, replaced by a careful distance that Alara had learned to keep, like a wall built brick by brick out of self-protection. She spent the rest of the evening in the kitchen, helping Nora clean dishes long after the other servants had gone to bed, simply because it delayed the moment when she would have to return to her small room upstairs and lie awake listening to the party's last echoes fade into silence. It was nearly midnight when she finally climbed the back stairs, her legs aching, her cheeks still faintly warm. She did not expect to find her mother waiting outside her door. Lady Voss stood in the dim hallway, still dressed in her evening gown, a glass of wine in her hand. Her face, usually composed and pleasant for company, had slipped into something harder now that the guests were gone. There was a letter in her other hand, crumpled slightly, as though it had been read and reread with growing anger. "Mother," Ilara said carefully. "Is something wrong?" "Wrong," Lady Voss repeated, and laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Everything is wrong. Julian Ashworth's family has learned of our debts. They are threatening to end the engagement unless the matter is settled by the end of the month. Do you understand what that means? Celeste's future, our family's last chance, and it is slipping away because this family cannot pay what it owes." Ilara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not somehow become her fault. "And whose fault is that?" her mother continued, stepping closer. "Your father left us with nothing but debts, and a title with no money behind it. And you have done nothing these past years but eat our food and take up space in this house that we can barely afford to keep." "I have tried to help," Ilara said quietly. "I mend the linens, I keep the accounts, You keep the accounts," her mother interrupted, her voice rising. "And still, we are drowning. Perhaps it is time you learned what it means to earn your keep somewhere else." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Ilara had heard before. She had been threatened with punishment many times, with cold silence, with locked doors and missed meals, but never with this. "Mother, please," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "This is my home." "This was never truly your home," Lady Voss said, and something in her eyes, some last thin thread of restraint, seemed to snap entirely. "You are a reminder of everything I lost, and I am tired of looking at you." What happened next came so quickly that Ilara barely had time to raise her arms in defense. Her mother struck her again, harder this time, driven by wine and grief and years of buried resentment finally breaking free. Ilara stumbled back against the wall, her ears ringing, and before she could steady herself, her mother had thrown open her bedroom door and was pulling a traveling cloak from the wardrobe, shoving it into her arms. "Get out," Lady Voss said, breathing hard. "Leave this house tonight, and do not come back. You are no daughter of mine." "Mother, get out." The shout echoed down the corridor, loud enough that a door creaked open somewhere below. Ilara did not wait to see who had heard. She clutched the cloak to her chest, her hands trembling, and walked past her mother without another word, because there was nothing left to say that would change what was happening. She did not pack a bag. There was no time, and she suspected that even if there had been, her mother would not have allowed it. She simply walked down the front steps of the only home she had ever known, wearing a thin cloak over her evening dress, and stepped out into a night that had turned suddenly, bitterly cold. Behind her, she heard the heavy front door close, and then the sound of a bolt sliding into place. Ilara stood on the gravel drive for a long moment, staring up at the dark windows of the house, half expecting someone to call her back, to say it had all been a terrible mistake, brought on by wine and grief, and the stress of the evening. No one came. The windows stayed dark. Somewhere above, she thought she saw a curtain move, Nora perhaps, or even Celeste, but no door opened, and no voice called her name. She was alone. The night air bit through the thin fabric of her cloak as she began to walk, though she had no idea where she was walking to. The Voss estate sat at the edge of a small village, surrounded by long stretches of countryside road that led toward the larger towns, but at this hour those roads were empty, dark, and unfamiliar in a way they had never seemed in daylight. She thought of knocking on a neighbor's door, but shame stopped her. What would she say? That her own mother had thrown her out into the night? Word would spread through the village by morning, and even now, some stubborn, foolish part of her still wanted to protect her mother's reputation. So she walked instead, following the road because it was the only path she knew, her thin shoes growing damp with dew, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The stars above were sharp and clear, indifferent to the small, frightened figure moving beneath them. She thought of her father, of the gentle way he used to speak to her, and wondered, not for the first time, what he would think if he could see her now, cast out of the very house he had built for his family, walking alone into a darkness with no clear end. An hour passed, perhaps more. Elara lost track of time the way one does when cold and grief blur together into a single, aching sensation. Her legs ached. Her hands had gone numb inside her thin gloves. She began to wonder, with a kind of distant fear, whether she might simply keep walking, until she could walk no further, and what would happen then. It was the sound of wheels on gravel that broke through her thoughts, the steady, rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves, and the creak of a large carriage moving along the road behind her. Elara turned, startled, shielding her eyes against the sudden glow of carriage lamps cutting through the darkness. For a moment, fear rose in her chest. A lone woman, on an empty road at night, had every reason to fear an approaching carriage. But there was nowhere to hide, and her body was too exhausted to run. The carriage slowed as it drew near her, its polished black frame gleaming faintly under the lamplight, marked with a crest she did not recognize. A hawk in flight, wings spread wide over a shield. It was the carriage of someone with wealth, someone with a title far greater than her own family's fading name. It came to a stop just a few feet away from her, the horses breathing heavily in the cold, their breath curling like smoke into the night air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elara stood frozen on the roadside, uncertain whether to speak, to run, or simply to wait. Then, slowly, the carriage door opened. A man's voice, low and even, came from within the shadowed interior. "You should not be standing in the middle of the road at this hour. It is not safe." Elara could not see his face clearly in the darkness. Only the outline of broad shoulders, and the faint gleam of dark eyes, watching her with an unreadable expression. Something about his voice was cold, controlled, entirely without warmth, and yet he had stopped. He had not simply ridden past a stranger alone in the night, as so many others surely would have. "I am sorry," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I did not mean to block the road. I will move aside." "That is not what I asked," the voice replied. "I asked why you are out here, alone, dressed for a ball, and not for a winter road." Elara hesitated. Pride, even now, even in this state, made her reluctant to admit the truth to a stranger. But exhaustion and cold had worn down whatever pride remained, and the words came out before she could stop them. "My mother has put me out of our house," she said quietly. "I have nowhere to go tonight." There was a pause from within the carriage, long enough that Elara wondered if she had said too much, if the stranger would simply close the door and ride on, leaving her to whatever fate awaited her on this empty road. But then the door opened wider, and a gloved hand extended toward her from the shadows. "Get in," the voice said, still cold, still without warmth, but firm in a way that left no room for refusal. "You will freeze to death out here before morning." Elara looked at the offered hand, at the dark carriage beyond it, and felt the sharp, dizzying uncertainty of a decision that would change everything. She did not know this man's name. She did not know where the road ahead might lead, or what kind of life waited for her beyond tonight. But behind her lay only a locked door, and a mother who had called her no daughter at all, and ahead lay an unknown stranger who had, at the very least, chosen to stop. She placed her hand in his, and stepped up into the carriage, leaving the cold, empty road behind her. The carriage interior was warmer than anything Elara had felt in hours, lined with dark velvet and lit by a single small lamp that swayed gently with the motion of the wheels. She sat stiffly on the seat across from the stranger, her damp cloak dripping onto the polished floor, painfully aware of how out of place she must have looked, a shivering, disheveled young woman inside a carriage that clearly belonged to someone of great wealth. Now that the light fell across his face, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp, composed features and dark hair swept back from a high forehead. His eyes were a deep gray, watching her with the same careful, unreadable expression he had worn on the road, as though he were assessing a problem, rather than looking at a person. He wore a dark coat of fine wool, tailored perfectly to his frame, and a signet ring on his smallest finger that caught the lamplight when he moved. "You have not told me your name," he said, breaking the silence. "Elara," she answered. "Elara Whitmore." "Whitmore." He repeated the name as though testing it, searching his memory. "Of the Voss estate near Ashford Village?" Alara stiffened. You know my family? I know of your family, he corrected. Lady Margaret Voss is known in certain circles for her devotion to appearances. It seems that devotion does not extend to her own household. His tone was flat, almost clinical, but there was something beneath it, not quite sympathy, but perhaps recognition of cruelty when he saw its results sitting across from him. You have not told me your name either, Alara said, finding a thread of courage despite her exhaustion. Alistair Graves, he said, Duke of Ashgrave. The name landed with a quiet weight. Alara had heard of Duke Ashgrave before, in the way one heard of distant, important figures, mentioned occasionally at gatherings, spoken of with a mixture of respect and unease. He was known to be enormously wealthy, controlling estates and business interests across 3 counties, and equally known for his refusal to attend social functions, his coldness towards suitors sent by hopeful families, and the rumors that had followed him since his wife's death 3 years prior. Some said grief had hardened him. Others said he had always been this way, and grief had simply given him an excuse to stop pretending otherwise. I did not expect to find myself in a duke's carriage tonight, Alara said quietly. Nor did I expect to find a young woman standing alone in the middle of a country road at midnight, he replied. It seems this evening has surprised us both. There was a pause as the carriage rolled steadily onward, the rhythm of hooves on packed earth, the only sound between them. Alara studied her hands, trying to think clearly despite the cold that still lingered in her bones, and the shock of everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had no plan. She had no money, no belongings beyond the cloak on her shoulders, and nowhere in the world that could reasonably be called home. May I ask where you are taking me? She said finally. That depends on where you wish to go, the Duke replied. Do you have family beyond the Voss household, relations who might take you in? Alara shook her head slowly. My father's family disowned him when he married my mother. There has been no contact in years. My mother's relations live too far to reach tonight, and I doubt they would welcome a niece who arrives at their door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a story that reflects poorly on their family name. Then you have no one, the Duke said. It was not a question, simply a statement of fact, delivered without cruelty, but without softness either. It appears not, Alara admitted, and hated how the words tasted in her mouth, how completely alone they made her feel when spoken aloud to a stranger. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond the carriage window, though there was nothing to see in the darkness outside. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Still cold, still measured, but carrying the tone of a man working through a calculation rather than offering comfort. I find myself in an unusual situation, he said, one that, strangely enough, your presence tonight may help resolve. Alara looked up, uncertain what he meant. I do not understand. My late father's will contains a condition regarding the family estate and title, the Duke explained. A clause, added in his final years, states that should I remain unmarried past a certain date, control of certain properties and holdings will transfer to my cousin, Lord Harwick Ashgrave. That date arrives in 3 months' time. Alara blinked, trying to follow the sudden shift in conversation. Then you must marry, or lose your inheritance. Precisely, the Duke said. My cousin has spent the past year positioning himself to claim those holdings, certain that I would never remarry after. He paused, and something briefly flickered across his composed features, before vanishing again. After my late wife's passing, he believes my grief will hand him everything he wants. And you intend to prove him wrong, Alara said slowly, beginning to understand the direction of his thoughts, though the full weight of it had not yet settled on her. I intend to prevent a man I despise from inheriting what my father built, the Duke corrected. Whether that requires a genuine marriage, or merely the appearance of one, is a matter I have not yet resolved. But finding a suitable woman, one without complicated family entanglements or ambitions of her own, willing to enter such an arrangement on short notice, has proven more difficult than I expected. Alara stared at him, the implications slowly becoming clear. You are suggesting that I am suggesting a proposal of convenience, the Duke said plainly, cutting through her hesitation with the same efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. You require a home, protection, and a future beyond whatever awaited you on that road tonight. I require a wife, at least in name, before the terms of my father's will take effect. It would be a contract, nothing more. You would want for nothing: clothing, comfort, security, a place in society far beyond anything the Voss household could offer you. In exchange, you would present yourself as my wife, manage my household affairs, and ensure my cousin's claim never succeeds. The carriage rattled on through the darkness, while Alara sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of an offer so sudden and so strange that it felt almost like a dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. Marriage to a duke, a man she had known for less than an hour, cold-eyed and unreadable, offering her security in exchange for nothing more than her presence and her silence about the true nature of their arrangement. "You do not know me," she said finally. "I could be anyone. I could have lied about everything you have heard tonight." "I am an excellent judge of character, Miss Whitmore," the Duke said, and for the first time, something almost like dry humor touched the edge of his voice. "And I have made careful inquiries about your family in recent months, for reasons unrelated to tonight. I know enough of your circumstances to trust that your story is true, and I know enough of your mother's reputation to understand why a daughter of that household might be standing alone on a road at midnight, with nowhere else to go." "You have investigated my family?" Alara asked, startled. "I investigate many families," the Duke said simply. "It is a habit born of necessity, not curiosity regarding you specifically. Though I admit, finding you on this particular road tonight is a coincidence I did not anticipate, however useful it may prove to be." Alara turned the offer over in her mind, searching for the flaw in it, the trap she felt certain must be hidden somewhere within such a strange and sudden proposal. But exhaustion made clear thought difficult, and beneath the exhaustion lay something else, a flicker of possibility she had not allowed herself to feel in years. A life away from her mother's cruelty, a home that was truly her own, even if it came wrapped in a stranger's cold formality. Safety, at the very least, which was more than she had possessed an hour ago. "If I agree," she said slowly, "what would be expected of me, beyond appearing as your wife?" "Discretion," the Duke said, "patience with a household that will likely be suspicious of a sudden marriage, and a willingness to maintain the arrangement for as long as circumstances require, without expectation of anything beyond what has been agreed." "And after, when the 3 months have passed and your inheritance is secured?" The Duke's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. "We will address that when the time comes," he said. "For now, I am offering you a choice you did not have an hour ago. You may accept it, or I will see you delivered safely to lodging in the nearest town, with funds enough to begin wherever you choose. The decision is entirely yours." It was, Alara realized, an honest offer, stripped of any pretense of romance or affection, exactly as cold and practical as the man who made it. And perhaps that honesty was what finally convinced her, more than any warmth or persuasion could have. There was no trick hidden in flattering words, no false promise of love she would later discover to be empty, only a plain exchange, her presence for her safety, her silence for her security. She thought of the house she had left behind, of her mother's voice calling her no daughter at all, of the locked door and the bolt sliding shut behind her. She thought of Celeste's engagement, secured and celebrated, while her own future had been thrown out into the cold without a second thought. And she thought of the years ahead, stretching out either as a woman alone with nothing, or as the wife, in name if nothing else, of a duke, with the power to ensure she never suffered such cruelty again. "I accept," she said quietly, before she could talk herself out of it. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but a subtle easing of the tension that had held his shoulders rigid since the carriage door first opened. "Then it is settled," he said. "We will marry within the week, quietly, before word can spread and complicate matters. You will come to Ashgrave Manor tonight and remain there until arrangements are made." Alara nodded, though her mind still reeled from the speed of everything unfolding around her. An hour ago, she had been a daughter cast out into the cold. Now she was to become a duchess, bound by contract rather than affection, to a man whose eyes held more calculation than warmth. "May I ask one thing?" she said, as the carriage rolled on through the dark countryside. "Before we proceed further?" "You may ask," the Duke said. "Your wife?" Alara said carefully, watching his face for any reaction. "What happened to her?" The warmth that had briefly touched his expression vanished entirely, replaced by the same cold composure she had first seen on the road. "That," he said, turning his gaze toward the window and the darkness beyond, "is not a story for tonight." Alara did not press further. She had learned, in a house full of secrets and buried grief, exactly when to stop asking questions. She settled back against the velvet seat instead, watching the passing darkness, and wondered what kind of life awaited her at the end of this road, in a manor belonging to a man who had just offered her everything, and nothing all at once. The carriage rolled on through the night, carrying her further from everything she had known, and closer to everything she could not yet imagine. Ashgrave Manor rose out of the darkness, like something from an old tale, its stone towers black against the night sky, its many windows dark except for a single light burning in an upper chamber. The carriage passed through a wide iron gate, wheels crunching over a long gravel drive, lined with bare winter trees, before finally coming to a stop, before wide stone steps leading to an enormous front door. Alara had grown up in a house that once carried some measure of grandeur, before debts and decline stripped it of its shine. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the sheer scale of Ashgrave Manor. It seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its architecture severe and commanding, exactly like the man who now stepped down from the carriage and turned to offer her his hand. "Welcome to your new home," the Duke said, though there was no warmth in the words, only a statement of fact delivered as plainly as everything else he had said that night. Alara took his hand and stepped down onto the gravel, pulling her damp cloak tighter around her shoulders as the cold night air swept across the open grounds. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing an older woman in a dark gray dress, a ring of keys at her waist, her expression shifting from surprise to careful neutrality as she took in the sight of her employer arriving with an unknown young woman at such a late hour. "Your Grace," the woman said, curtsying briefly, "we did not expect you until morning." "Circumstances changed, Mrs. Prentice," the Duke said, stepping past her into the grand entrance hall, his tone leaving no room for further questions. "This is Miss Whitmore. She will be staying with us. See that a room is prepared immediately, and that she is given whatever she requires: dry clothing, food, rest." Mrs. Prentice's sharp eyes moved to Alara, taking in her damp cloak, her disheveled hair, the faint mark still visible on her cheek despite the hours that had passed. Whatever judgment formed behind her composed expression remained unspoken, though Alara suspected the housekeeper had drawn her own conclusions about the strange circumstances of her arrival. "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Prentice said, and turned to lead the way deeper into the house. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire ground floor of the Voss estate, its ceiling rising 2 stories above a floor of polished dark stone, a wide staircase curving upward toward shadowed corridors above. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashgrave ancestors watching down with the same cold, composed expressions Alara had already come to associate with the Duke himself. She followed Mrs. Prentice up the staircase, aware of the Duke's footsteps fading away behind her as he turned toward a different wing of the house, leaving her alone, with a housekeeper whose silence felt more like judgment than courtesy. The room she was given was larger than any bedroom she had ever slept in, furnished with a great 4-poster bed, a fireplace already being lit by a young maid, and heavy curtains drawn against the cold night outside. It was beautiful in a distant, unfamiliar way, everything arranged with precision and expense, nothing out of place, nothing that spoke of warmth or lived experience. It felt, Alara thought as she stood in the center of the room, less like a home and more like a very fine cage. "There are gowns in the wardrobe that should fit you reasonably well," Mrs. Prentice said, her tone carefully neutral. "They belong to a cousin of His Grace, who visited some years ago and left them behind. I will have proper measurements taken tomorrow, for garments of your own." "Thank you," Alara said, still feeling entirely out of place in the grandeur surrounding her. Mrs. Prentice paused at the door, studying her for a moment longer than courtesy required. "May I ask, Miss Whitmore, how long you intend to stay at Ashgrave Manor?" "I believe that has not yet been fully decided," Alara said carefully, unsure how much the Duke intended his household to know about the arrangement between them. Something flickered across the housekeeper's face. Not quite suspicion, but close to it. "His Grace does not often bring guests to the manor," she said. "Certainly not at midnight, and certainly not without prior notice. I mention this only so you understand that your presence here is unusual. I am aware, Alara said quietly. Mrs. Prentice nodded once. Whatever further thoughts she held kept carefully behind a composed expression, and left the room without another word, closing the door softly behind her. Alara sank down onto the edge of the enormous bed, finally alone, and allowed herself, for the first time since the slap in the drawing room hours earlier, to simply breathe. The events of the night pressed in on her now that the immediate danger had passed. Her mother's raised hand, the bolt sliding shut behind her, the long, cold walk down an empty road, and then the carriage, and the Duke, and an offer of marriage so strange and sudden it still did not feel entirely real. She looked down at her hands, still faintly trembling, and wondered whether she had made the right choice, or whether she had simply traded one uncertain danger for another, dressed in finer clothing and grander rooms. She did not sleep well that night, drifting in and out of restless dreams, filled with locked doors and cold roads, waking finally as pale morning light crept through the gap in the heavy curtains. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a young maid carrying a tray of tea and bread, along with a message that His Grace wished to see her in his study once she had eaten and dressed. Alara chose the simplest of the gowns left in the wardrobe, a deep green dress that fit reasonably well despite being clearly tailored for someone slightly taller than herself, and made her way downstairs following the directions the young maid provided. The manor looked different in daylight, still severe, still grand, but with sunlight filtering through tall windows that softened some of the previous night's shadows. She found the Duke's study at the end of a long corridor, the door slightly ajar. He sat behind a large desk covered in papers and ledgers, dressed now in a dark morning coat, rather than his traveling clothes, his expression as composed and unreadable as it had been the night before. He looked up as she entered, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk. "You slept well, I hope," he said, though the question carried the tone of formality rather than genuine concern. "Well enough," Alara replied, taking the offered seat. "Good. We have matters to discuss before the arrangements proceed further." He set down his pen and folded his hands atop the desk, studying her with the same assessing look he had worn in the carriage. "I have sent word to the local magistrate to arrange the necessary documents for a marriage license. Given the urgency of the timeline, I intend for the ceremony to take place within the week, conducted quietly here at the manor, with only the required witnesses present." "So soon," Alara said, though she had known, on some level, that speed was the entire purpose of the arrangement. "My cousin will hear of this eventually, and when he does, I expect him to attempt some manner of interference," the Duke said. "The sooner the marriage is legally finalized, the less opportunity he has to prevent it. I trust you understand the necessity." "I understand," Alara said, "though I confess I know very little about what will be expected of me beyond the ceremony itself." "You will act as mistress of this household," the Duke said. "You will oversee domestic matters, accompany me to whatever social functions cannot reasonably be avoided, and present, to all outside this house, the appearance of a genuine marriage. Within these walls, you may consider yourself free to occupy your time as you see fit, provided it does not interfere with the arrangement's success." "And what of you?" Alara asked. "What am I to understand about your own habits, your own expectations, so that I do not make some misstep in front of your guests or your staff?" The Duke's expression shifted slightly, something almost like approval passing behind his gray eyes, at the practicality of her question. "A fair concern," he said. "I keep to a disciplined schedule. I rise early. I manage my business affairs personally, rather than delegating them entirely to stewards, and I have little patience for idle social conversation. My staff has learned not to expect warmth from me, and I would not wish you to expect it either. This arrangement is built on practicality, not affection, and I intend to keep it that way." There was something almost defensive in the way he said it, as though he were warning her, or perhaps warning himself, against the possibility of anything more developing between them. Alara filed the observation away without comment, sensing that pressing further would gain her nothing but his continued coldness. "I understand the terms," she said instead. "I will do my part." "Good," the Duke said, returning his attention to the papers on his desk. The conversation apparently concluded as far as he was concerned. "Mrs. Prentice will assist you with whatever preparations are needed before the ceremony. If you require anything else, you have only to ask the staff." Alara rose from her chair, understanding the dismissal. but paused at the study door before leaving. "Your Grace," she said, and he looked up at the use of his title. "Thank you for stopping the carriage last night. You did not have to." Something passed briefly across his face, there, and gone so quickly, she almost doubted she had seen it at all. "No," he agreed quietly. "I did not." He said nothing further, and Alara left the study with those words echoing in her mind, wondering what exactly had driven a man so guarded, so deliberately cold, to stop for a stranger on a dark road, when every practical instinct might have told him to simply ride past. The days that followed passed in a strange blur of preparation and adjustment. Alara learned the layout of the manor's many rooms, met the staff, who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, and sat through fittings for new gowns that Mrs. Prentice insisted were necessary for a woman soon to become a duchess. She saw little of the Duke himself, who kept largely to his study and his business affairs, emerging mainly for brief, formal meals, during which conversation remained polite but distant. It was during one such meal, 3 days before the planned ceremony, that Nora arrived at the manor's servant entrance, breathless and anxious, carrying news that would complicate everything Alara had believed was settled. "Your mother knows," Nora said, once she had been shown into the small sitting room where Alara received her, still wearing her traveling cloak, her face flushed from having hurried the entire distance from the Voss estate. "Word reached her yesterday that you were seen entering Ashgrave Manor the night you left. She is furious, Alara. She says you have humiliated the family, running off to a duke's household like some scheming fortune hunter. She means to come here herself and put a stop to whatever arrangement you have made." Alara felt the warmth drain from her face, despite the fire crackling in the hearth beside her. She had known, of course, that her mother would eventually learn where she had gone. She had simply hoped for more time before that knowledge arrived at Ashgrave Manor's door. "When?" she asked. "When does she mean to come?" "I do not know for certain," Nora said. "But she left the house in a temper this morning, and I fear it will not be long." Alara looked toward the window, where the pale afternoon light was already beginning to fade toward evening, and felt the fragile peace of the past few days crack beneath the weight of what was coming. Lady Margaret Voss arrived at Ashgrave Manor the following morning, her carriage rattling up the long gravel drive with far less dignity than the Duke's had shown days earlier. Alara watched from an upstairs window as her mother descended, dressed in her finest traveling gown despite the early hour, her face already set into the composed, pleasant mask she wore so well in front of strangers, a mask that Alara knew concealed something far sharper underneath. By the time Alara reached the entrance hall, Mrs. Prentice had already shown Lady Voss into the drawing room, and the Duke himself had emerged from his study, drawn by the sound of an unexpected arrival. Alara arrived just in time to hear her mother's voice, honeyed and careful, drifting from the drawing room. "Your Grace, I do apologize for arriving without notice, but I am afraid a matter of some urgency brings me here. My daughter has, I fear, taken advantage of your kindness under rather misleading circumstances." Alara stepped into the doorway in time to see her mother rise from the settee where she had seated herself, extending a hand toward the Duke with practiced grace. He did not take it, merely inclined his head slightly, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Lady Voss," he said, "I confess, I am curious what circumstances you believe require correction." "My daughter suffers from a certain instability," Lady Voss said, her voice dripping with false concern. "She left our household in a state of distress, following a minor family disagreement, and I fear she may have presented her situation to you in a manner designed to gain sympathy, rather than reflect the truth. She is prone to exaggeration, Your Grace, and I would hate to see a man of your standing drawn into a scheme born of a troubled young woman's imagination." Alara felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and disbelief at hearing her mother rewrite the events of that night so smoothly, so effortlessly, as though the truth were nothing more than clay to be reshaped for whatever purpose suited her. "That is not true," Alara said, stepping fully into the room. Both her mother and the Duke turned toward her, and for a brief moment, something like alarm flickered across Lady Voss's composed features, before it was swiftly hidden away again. "Alara, darling," her mother said, her tone shifting instantly into warmth, so convincing that Alara almost admired the skill of it, even as it disgusted her. "I have been so worried. Come home with me now. and we shall put this entire misunderstanding behind us." "There is no misunderstanding," Alara said, keeping her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "You struck me in front of the entire household and threw me out into the cold with nothing. I have not exaggerated a single detail of what happened that night." Lady Voss's expression tightened, the warmth flickering for just a moment, before she caught herself, offering the Duke a pained, apologetic smile instead. "You see, Your Grace, precisely the sort of dramatic accusation I feared she might present. A mother disciplines her children when necessary. That is hardly the crime she describes." The Duke had remained silent through the exchange, his gray eyes moving between the two women with the same careful, assessing look Alara had come to recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness that even Lady Voss's practiced charm seemed unable to soften. "I was the one who found your daughter on the road that night, Lady Voss," he said. "Alone, in the middle of winter, with a mark on her cheek that no fabricated story could produce. I do not require her testimony to know what occurred, as I witnessed the consequences of it myself." Lady Voss's mask slipped further, something colder and more calculating flickering beneath the surface. "Then you understand, Your Grace, why I have come. Whatever arrangement she has proposed to you, whatever story she has told to secure your protection, I must insist she return home, where she belongs. It is not appropriate for an unmarried young woman to reside in a bachelor's household under such circumstances, regardless of the reasons given." "She will not be returning to your household," the Duke said, his tone final. "Miss Whitmore and I are to be married within the week. She will reside here as my wife, and as such, any concerns regarding her welfare fall under my responsibility, not yours." The silence that followed was heavy enough that Alara could hear the fire crackling in the hearth, could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Lady Voss stared at the Duke, her composed mask finally cracking entirely, revealing the raw calculation beneath. "Married," she repeated slowly. "You intend to marry her?" "I do." For a moment, something almost like triumph flickered across Lady Voss's face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for Alara to miss it entirely. Her mother had come here prepared for scandal, prepared to reclaim a disgraced daughter and control the narrative of her disappearance. She had not been prepared for the possibility that Alara might rise, rather than fall, from the circumstances of that night. "Well," Lady Voss said, recovering her composure with impressive speed, "this changes matters considerably. A duchess in the family would certainly help resolve certain financial difficulties currently troubling the household." "I have no intention of settling your family's debts, Lady Voss," the Duke said, before she could continue further. "Nor do I intend for my marriage to become a source of income for a family that treated its own daughter with such cruelty. If you have come here seeking financial assistance, you will find none forthcoming." Lady Voss's expression hardened, the last traces of false warmth vanishing entirely. She turned her sharp gaze toward Alara, and for a moment, Alara saw clearly the woman who had struck her 3 nights earlier, stripped of all pretense. "You have always been ungrateful," Lady Voss said quietly, venom lacing every word. "I raised you, fed you, sheltered you for 18 years, and this is how you repay me. Running to the first wealthy stranger who offers you a title, abandoning your family the moment an opportunity presents itself." "I did not abandon anyone," Alara said, her voice steadier now, strengthened by the Duke's presence beside her, and by the simple, undeniable truth of her own words. "You cast me out. You called me no daughter of yours, and locked the door behind me. Whatever happens now is the result of that choice, not mine." Lady Voss's mouth tightened into a thin line, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all, seemingly searching for some argument that might turn the situation back in her favor. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders and gathered what remained of her dignity, though it sat uneasily on her now, brittle and thin. "I see there is nothing further to discuss here," she said coldly. "I hope, Your Grace, that you understand precisely what sort of woman you are choosing to marry." "I believe I understand a great deal more than you assume," the Duke replied evenly. "I would ask that you leave now. Miss Whitmore has no obligation to you, and I have no patience for further attempts to manipulate this situation to your advantage." Lady Voss's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing more. She swept past them both toward the entrance hall, pausing only once at the door, to cast a final look back at Alara, a look filled with something that might have been regret. though Alara suspected it was closer to simple frustration at losing control of a situation she had believed she could easily reshape. Then she was gone, the front door closing behind her with far less force than the one that had shut Alara out 3 nights before. The silence that followed her departure stretched long and heavy. Alara stood in the drawing room, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had passed, the adrenaline of the moment draining away and leaving something rawer and more exhausted in its place. "Are you well?" the Duke asked, his voice softer than she had yet heard it, though still carrying its usual careful distance. "I believe so," Alara said, though her voice betrayed the effort it took to sound composed. "I did not expect her to come so soon, nor did I expect that. Your mother strikes me as a woman accustomed to controlling every situation she enters," the Duke observed. "It is a dangerous habit when it meets someone unwilling to be controlled." Alara looked up at him, studying his composed features, searching for whatever had driven him to defend her so firmly against her own mother's accusations. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you said to her. I did not expect you to intervene so directly." "I made an agreement with you," the Duke said simply. "I do not break my agreements, regardless of who challenges them." He paused, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. "Besides, I find I have little patience for cruelty, disguised as concern. I have encountered enough of it in my own family to recognize it easily in others." The comment hung between them, an unexpected glimpse into something personal, something the Duke rarely allowed to surface in their careful, formal conversations. Alara wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what experience had taught him to recognize her mother's particular brand of cruelty so quickly and so surely. But before she could find the words, he had already turned away, retreating back toward the safety of his study and the careful distance he maintained from anything resembling genuine connection. Still, as Alara made her way back upstairs, her mother's visit finally behind her, she found herself turning his words over in her mind. He had defended her without hesitation, had seen through her mother's practiced deceptions in moments, had spoken of cruelty disguised as concern with the particular clarity of someone who had lived through it himself. Whatever coldness the Duke wore like armor, she began to suspect, for the first time, that it was not the whole truth of who he was. The wedding, when it came 4 days later, was a quiet affair, conducted in the manor's small private chapel, with only Mrs. Prentice and the estate's steward present as witnesses. Alara wore a simple gown of pale silver, her hair arranged plainly, and the Duke stood beside her in formal black, his expression composed and unreadable as always, as the local clergyman spoke the words that bound them together in the eyes of the law, if not yet in any truer sense. When it was finished, when the papers had been signed and the brief ceremony concluded, the Duke turned to her, with the same careful distance he had maintained since the night they met. "It is done," he said simply. "You are now the Duchess of Ashgrave." Alara looked down at the ring now resting on her finger, cold and unfamiliar, and wondered how strange it was that a life could change so completely in the span of a single week. From a daughter cast out into the freezing night, to a duchess standing in a quiet chapel, married to a man she barely knew, bound together by necessity rather than affection, and yet already, in ways she could not quite explain, beginning to feel less alone than she had in years. News of the marriage reached Lord Harwick Ashgrave within days, carried by whatever web of servants and informants he maintained across the county, and his response arrived at the manor in the form of a letter so carefully polite that its underlying threat was unmistakable to anyone who read closely enough. Alara found the Duke reading it one morning at breakfast, his expression darker than she had yet seen it. The paper gripped tightly enough that his knuckles had paled. "Trouble?" she asked, taking her seat across from him at the long dining table that still felt too large for just the two of them. "My cousin extends his congratulations," the Duke said, his voice flat with contained anger, "and expresses his eagerness to meet my new wife at the earliest opportunity, so that he might personally confirm the legitimacy of such a sudden and unexpected union." "He suspects the truth," Alara said. "He suspects something," the Duke corrected, setting the letter down with deliberate care, as though handling it too roughly might betray more anger than he wished to show. "Whether he has guessed the full truth of our arrangement, or simply smells opportunity in the speed of our marriage, I cannot yet say. But he will not accept this quietly. Harwick has spent a year positioning himself for my father's holdings, and he will not surrender that position without a fight." Alara set down her teacup, studying the tension visible in the line of the Duke's shoulders despite his composed expression. In the weeks since their marriage, she had begun to notice these small signs, the way his jaw tightened when certain topics arose, the way his eyes grew distant when conversation drifted too close to his late wife or his family's history. He revealed almost nothing directly, guarding his thoughts as carefully as he guarded everything else, but small cracks had begun to show, visible only to someone paying close attention. "What does he intend to do?" she asked. "I do not yet know," the Duke admitted, "but I intend to find out before he has the chance to act." He rose from the table, folding the letter and tucking it into his coat. "I have business in town today. I would ask that you remain at the manor until I return, and that you speak to no one of our arrangement beyond what has already been publicly established." "Of course," Alara said, though something in his sudden urgency left her uneasy for the remainder of the day. He did not return until well past dark, and when he finally did, he looked more troubled than she had yet seen him, his usual composure worn thin around the edges. He found her in the small sitting room, where she had taken to spending her evenings, a book open in her lap, though she had read little of it, her attention drawn repeatedly to the window and the long drive beyond, watching for the return of his carriage. "You look concerned," he said, taking the chair across from hers with the particular stiffness of a man exhausted by a difficult day. "I was concerned," Alara admitted. "You were gone longer than expected." Something flickered across his face at her words. Surprise, perhaps, that she had noticed his absence at all, that she had waited and worried in his absence, rather than simply continuing with her own affairs, indifferent to whether he returned at all. It was a small thing, but Alara saw it land somewhere beneath his careful composure. "Harwick has been spreading rumors in town," the Duke said finally, "suggesting that our marriage was arranged in haste to circumvent my father's will, that it lacks genuine sentiment, and questioning whether it should be considered legally binding under the terms of the inheritance clause." "Can he do that? Question the legitimacy of a marriage properly conducted?" "He can attempt it," the Duke said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Whether he succeeds is another matter entirely, but it will require effort to counter, and effort I had not anticipated needing to expend so soon." Alara considered this for a long moment, watching the firelight flicker across his tired features. "Then we must give him nothing to question," she said slowly. "If he means to claim our marriage lacks genuine sentiment, we must show him otherwise. Attend functions together. Behave, in every public setting, exactly as a married couple devoted to one another would behave." The Duke studied her with an expression she could not quite read. "You would be willing to do that, to perform such a role convincingly, knowing the truth of our arrangement?" "I married you to escape a life of cruelty and uncertainty," Alara said. "I do not intend to lose that safety, because your cousin wishes to reclaim what he believes is owed to him. If performing devotion in public secures what we have built here, then I am willing to do so." Something in the Duke's expression shifted then, a subtle warmth breaking through the careful coldness he wore so consistently, there and gone so quickly that Alara might have imagined it entirely had she not been watching so closely. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I did not expect such resolve from you." "You assumed I would be fragile," Alara said, unable to fully keep the edge from her voice. "Easily broken, given what you know of my circumstances." "I assumed nothing of the sort," the Duke said, and for the first time since she had known him, something almost like genuine feeling colored his voice. "I have watched you these past weeks. You have adapted to a life entirely foreign to you, managed a household far larger than anything you have known, and faced down your own mother without flinching. I do not consider you fragile, Alara. Quite the opposite." It was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the formal address he typically favored, and something about hearing it in his low, measured voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, one she was not entirely certain how to interpret. She said nothing, uncertain how to respond to such an unguarded observation from a man who so carefully controlled every word he spoke. In the days that followed, the Duke began including her more directly in matters beyond the household's domestic affairs, discussing with her the various social events he judged necessary to attend in order to counter his cousin's rumors, explaining the particular families and connections whose good opinion mattered most to securing his position. Alara found herself drawn into a world entirely foreign to anything she had known at the Voss estate. Grand assemblies, careful political conversations disguised as pleasant small talk, the constant awareness that every word and gesture might be observed and judged. It was at one such gathering, held at the estate of a prominent local family known for hosting the county's most important social events, that Alara first truly understood the weight of the role she had agreed to play. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and fine jewelry, filled with guests whose curious eyes followed the Duke and his new Duchess from the moment they entered, whispers trailing in their wake like a current beneath the music and conversation. "They are all watching us," Alara murmured, as they moved through the crowd, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm, as propriety demanded. "Let them watch," the Duke replied, his voice pitched low enough for her ears alone. "It matters only what conclusions they draw from what they see." As if summoned by the thought itself, Lord Harwick appeared before them moments later, emerging from the crowd with a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was a tall man, sharp-featured in a way that echoed the Duke's own appearance, though where the Duke's coldness seemed born of guarded restraint, Harwick's carried something far more openly predatory beneath its polite surface. "Cousin," Harwick said, his voice smooth and pleasant, entirely at odds with the sharpness in his gaze. "And this must be your new Duchess. I confess, the speed of your marriage left me quite astonished. One might almost suspect some urgent motivation behind such haste." "One might suspect many things, Harwick," the Duke replied evenly, "though I have found that most suspicions say more about the one holding them than the situation they concern." Harwick's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the deflection, his gaze shifting toward Alara with an assessing look that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "Miss Whitmore, was it? Forgive me. Duchess Ashgrave, now. Tell me, how did you find yourself so fortunate as to capture my cousin's attention so swiftly? I understand your family has fallen on rather difficult times of late." The insult was delivered with such polished courtesy that Alara suspected most listeners would miss its cruelty entirely, hearing only pleasant conversation, rather than the deliberate needle aimed at her family's declining fortunes. But she had spent 18 years learning to recognize cruelty, dressed in pleasant clothing, and she met Harwick's gaze, without flinching. "Fortune had little to do with it, Lord Harwick," she said, keeping her voice as smooth and composed as his own. "Your cousin recognized something worth valuing beyond a family's financial standing, which I understand is a quality not universally shared among those who might otherwise claim his position." The barb landed precisely as she intended, Harwick's composed expression flickering with brief, genuine surprise, before he recovered it into something colder. "Clever," he said, "and sharp-tongued as well. I begin to understand my cousin's sudden interest." "You understand nothing of my interests, Harwick," the Duke said, his voice carrying a warning edge that drew several nearby guests' curious glances. "I would advise you to remember that before you attempt any further games regarding my marriage or my household." Harwick held the Duke's gaze for a long, tense moment, something calculating passing behind his eyes, before he inclined his head in a shallow, mocking bow. "Of course, cousin. I meant no offense. I simply look forward to seeing how this arrangement unfolds in the months ahead." He turned his attention back to Alara one final time, his smile sharp as a blade disguised as courtesy. "Do enjoy the evening, Duchess. I suspect it may prove more eventful than you anticipate." He melted back into the crowd before either of them could respond further, leaving behind a tension that lingered long after his departure. Alara felt the Duke's arm tense beneath her hand, his composed exterior cracking just slightly to reveal the anger simmering beneath. "He means to cause trouble," Alara said quietly, once they had moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom. "He has meant to cause trouble since the day my father's will was read," the Duke replied. "The question is simply what form that trouble will take, and how prepared we will be to meet it when it arrives." Alara looked out across the glittering ballroom, at the curious eyes still occasionally drifting toward them, and felt, for the first time since her arrival at Ashgrave Manor, a genuine sense of partnership settling between herself and the man beside her, not merely a contract of convenience, but something closer to allies facing a shared threat together. Whatever trouble Harwick intended to bring, she found herself determined to face it not as a bystander in someone else's battle, but as the Duchess she had become, with everything that title now required of her. Weeks passed, and with them came a gradual shift in the rhythm of life at Ashgrave Manor. Alara found herself settling into her role with growing confidence, learning the names of every servant, understanding the particular demands of managing such a vast household, and slowly earning the trust of a staff that had initially regarded her with careful suspicion. Mrs. Prentice, in particular, had softened considerably since the night of Alara's arrival, offering small gestures of warmth that Alara suspected were rare, from a woman who guarded her own opinions as carefully as her employer guarded his. It was Mrs. Prentice, in fact, who first spoke to Alara of the Duke's late wife, though the conversation arose almost by accident one afternoon, while the two women were reviewing household accounts together in the small study Alara had claimed as her own. "You handle these figures better than the previous Duchess ever did," Mrs. Prentice observed, watching Alara work through a column of expenses with practiced efficiency. Lady Isabel had little interest in such matters. She preferred to leave household affairs entirely in my hands. Alara looked up, curiosity sparking despite her efforts to maintain professional distance from a topic she suspected remained painful for the household. "You knew her well, then?" "As well as anyone could," Mrs. Prentice said, something guarded entering her expression. "She was a beautiful woman, charming in company, much admired throughout the county. His Grace was quite devoted to her in the early years of their marriage." "What happened between them?" Alara asked carefully, uncertain whether the question crossed a boundary she should not test. Mrs. Prentice was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling over the account book. "That is not truly my story to tell, Your Grace," she said finally, using the formal title she had only recently begun applying to Alara with any consistency. "If you wish to understand what happened, I would suggest asking His Grace directly, though I will warn you that he does not speak of it easily." Alara let the matter rest, though the housekeeper's careful evasion only deepened her curiosity. She had noticed, in the weeks since their marriage, the particular way the Duke's expression shuddered whenever conversation drifted too near the subject of his first marriage. A coldness, distinct from his usual reserve, something closer to genuine pain, carefully buried beneath layers of controlled composure. The opportunity to understand more came sooner than she expected, arriving on an evening when a sudden storm kept them both confined to the manor's great library, unable to attend a planned social engagement due to roads made impassable by heavy rain. The Duke sat near the fire, a glass of wine untouched beside him, staring into the flames with an expression Alara had come to recognize as the particular distance that settled over him during quiet, unguarded moments. "You seem troubled tonight," she said, settling into the chair across from his, a book she had no real intention of reading, resting unopened in her lap. "The storm reminds me of another night, some years ago," the Duke said, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of some of its habitual reserve. "It is not a memory I visit willingly, but it seems tonight it has chosen to visit me regardless." Alara said nothing, sensing that pressing too directly might close whatever small door had begun to open. Instead, she waited, watching the firelight dance across his troubled features, until he finally continued speaking, almost as though the words had built up too much pressure to remain contained any longer. "Isabel and I married for love, or what I believed to be love at the time," he said. "I was young, foolish enough to believe that affection alone could sustain a marriage, regardless of circumstance. She was beautiful and charming, and I was thoroughly convinced of my good fortune in securing her hand." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "It took nearly 2 years for me to understand that her affection had been carefully performed, calculated to secure a title and fortune she valued far more than she valued me." "What happened?" Alara asked softly. "She grew bored of a husband, more interested in managing his estates than indulging her every want," the Duke said, bitterness creeping into his careful composure. "She began seeking entertainment elsewhere, first in extravagant spending that nearly bankrupted several of my smaller holdings, and eventually in the company of other men, conducted with a discretion that fooled everyone, except, eventually, myself." Alara felt something tighten in her chest, at the raw pain still evident beneath his measured words, understanding now the source of the careful walls he had built around himself, the coldness that had greeted her on that dark road months ago. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been terribly difficult to endure." "The affair itself was difficult enough," the Duke continued, as though he could not stop now that the words had finally found their way free. "But it was the storm that took her, in the end. She was traveling to meet one of her companions, on a night much like this one. Roads flooded, visibility poor. The carriage overturned attempting to cross a swollen river crossing. She did not survive. The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Alara had expected to hear that evening. She understood now, with sudden clarity, why he had stopped his carriage on that dark road months ago, why he could not simply ride past a woman alone and unprotected in the freezing night, regardless of how inconvenient such compassion might have proven. He had lost someone to circumstances not entirely unlike her own that night, alone, exposed, vulnerable to a darkness that had ultimately proven fatal. "I am sorry," Alara said again, unable to find better words for the weight of what he had shared. "You must have loved her very much, despite everything that happened." "I loved the woman I believed her to be," the Duke corrected, his voice steadying somewhat as he regained some measure of his usual composure. "By the time she died, I am not certain what remained of that love, beyond grief for what I had lost and anger at what she had become. It is a complicated thing to mourn someone you no longer entirely recognized. Is that why you have kept everyone at such distance since?" Alara asked, the question slipping free before she could reconsider its boldness. "Why you were so determined that our arrangement remained purely practical, without expectation of anything more?" The Duke's gaze met hers across the firelit room, something raw and unguarded visible in his expression for the first time since she had known him. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I did not wish to risk trusting anyone with anything beyond careful arrangement ever again. It seemed the safer path after everything Isabel's betrayal had cost me. My trust, certainly, but also my belief that affection could ever be entirely genuine, rather than calculated toward some hidden advantage." "I have no hidden advantage to seek," Alara said softly. "I have told you honestly, from the very first night, exactly why I accepted your offer. There has been no deception between us." "I know," the Duke said, and something in his voice suggested this realization had settled over him gradually, in the weeks since their marriage, rather than arriving as sudden revelation tonight. "It is, I confess, part of what has made this arrangement more comfortable than I anticipated. You have asked nothing of me beyond what was agreed, and offered honesty in return, which is more than I received from someone I once believed I loved entirely." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed his words, and Alara found herself studying the man across from her with new understanding, not the cold, calculating Duke who had offered her a practical arrangement on a dark road, but someone who had been wounded deeply enough to build walls thick enough to keep the entire world at careful distance, walls that seemed, in this quiet, storm-bound evening, to be showing their first small cracks. "Thank you," she said finally, "for trusting me with this. I understand now why it was not a story for that first night." "Perhaps," the Duke said, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him since their marriage began. "It simply required the right night, and the right company, before I found myself willing to share it at all." The storm continued outside, rain lashing against the tall windows of the library, but within the room, something had shifted between them. Subtle, fragile, but undeniably present. Alara did not know precisely what this new understanding meant for the careful, practical arrangement they had built together, but she found, as she finally rose to retire for the evening, that some part of her hoped it might mean something more than either of them had originally intended. The change between them, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed by the household. Mrs. Prentice began setting their evening meals with a quiet attentiveness that suggested she had observed something shifting, and even the younger servants seemed to move through the manor with a lighter energy, as though the entire house had sensed the thaw between its master and its new mistress. Alara found herself looking forward to the quiet hours she now shared with the Duke, evenings spent discussing estate matters that gradually gave way to conversations about books, about childhood memories, about small observations of the world that had nothing to do with contracts or arrangements at all. It was on one such evening, nearly 2 months after their marriage, that disaster struck without warning. Alara had gone riding that afternoon, accompanied only by a young groom, taking advantage of unusually mild weather to explore the eastern edge of the estate she had not yet visited. The path wound along a ridge overlooking a shallow river valley, offering a view of the countryside that Alara had grown genuinely fond of during her weeks at Ashgrave Manor. She had just turned her horse back toward the manor when a sudden noise, a hunter's gunshot from somewhere in the distant trees, entirely unrelated to her presence, startled her mount into a panic. The horse reared, then bolted, and Alara felt herself losing her grip on the reins as the animal charged wildly along the narrow ridge path, far too close to the steep slope, falling away toward the river below. She heard the groom shouting behind her, heard her own heartbeat pounding louder than the thundering hooves beneath her, and then, with terrifying suddenness, the horse's hoof caught on loose stone, and both horse and rider went down hard. She did not remember much of what followed: the impact, the sharp pain in her arm and side, the frightened whinny of the horse scrambling back to its feet nearby. She remembered the groom's panicked face above her, remembered being lifted carefully and carried, remembered very little else until she woke hours later in her own bed at the manor, her arm bound tightly against her chest, her whole body aching with a deep, throbbing pain. The Duke was seated beside her bed when she opened her eyes, his face pale and drawn in a way she had never seen before, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he had not slept at all. The moment he saw her stir, something close to relief broke visibly across his composed features, a rawness of emotion he had never once allowed her to witness. "Ilara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not attempt to hide. "You are awake. What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar even to her own ears. "You fell from your horse," the Duke said, reaching for her uninjured hand and holding it with a gentleness that surprised her. "The physician says your arm is broken and you have bruised ribs, but nothing beyond that. You were fortunate. The fall could easily have been far worse, given the terrain." Alara noticed, then, the state of him. His cravat loosened, his coat discarded somewhere, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that spoke of hours spent at her bedside rather than attending to any of his usual affairs. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked. "Since they brought you back," he admitted. "I did not wish to leave until I was certain you would wake." Something in his voice, in the raw vulnerability so unlike his usual careful control, told Alara more clearly than any words could have that whatever had begun growing between them in recent weeks had deepened into something neither of them had originally intended when they made their practical arrangement on that dark road months earlier. She squeezed his hand gently, ignoring the ache in her arm as she did so. "I am well," she said softly. "You need not have worried so." "I could not help it," the Duke said, and something in his expression suggested this admission cost him a great deal, breaking through walls he had spent years carefully constructing. "When the groom arrived at the manor without you, when he described what had happened, I have never in my life felt such fear. I thought I understood, when Isabel died, what it meant to lose someone. But this fear was different, sharper, because it was not grief for something already lost, but terror at the possibility of losing something I had only just begun to recognize as precious." Alara felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, moved by the raw honesty of his words, so different from the careful, guarded man who had offered her a practical arrangement in a cold carriage months before. "Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time since their marriage began, and watched something shift further in his expression at the sound of it. "I am here. I am not going anywhere." "I know that now," he said quietly, "but I did not know it, sitting here these past hours, uncertain whether you would wake at all. It made me understand something I had been unwilling to admit to myself these past weeks." "What is that?" Alara asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "That this arrangement between us has become something far more than practical necessity," the Duke said, his gray eyes holding hers steadily, despite the vulnerability so plainly visible within them. "That I have come to care for you, Alara, in ways I swore to myself I would never allow again, after everything Isabel's betrayal cost me. I did not intend for this to happen. I fought against it, in truth, for longer than I am proud to admit. But sitting here these past hours, I could no longer deny what has grown between us." Alara's heart swelled with an emotion she had not expected to feel so fully, or so suddenly, despite the ache still throbbing through her injured body. "I have felt it too," she admitted, "for weeks now, though I did not dare hope you might feel the same, given everything you told me of your first marriage." "You are nothing like Isabel," the Duke said firmly, his thumb tracing gentle circles across the back of her hand. "You have offered nothing but honesty, since the moment I found you on that road, and you have earned trust I believed myself incapable of offering anyone ever again." The physician arrived shortly afterward to check on Alara's recovery, and the intimate moment between them dissolved into the practical business of ensuring her injuries were healing properly. But something fundamental had shifted between them during those quiet hours, a truth spoken aloud that neither of them could now unspeak, transforming their careful arrangement of convenience into something neither had anticipated when the carriage door first opened on that dark, freezing road. Alara's recovery took several weeks, during which the Duke rarely left her side longer than his most pressing business affairs demanded, his cold reserve replaced by a warmth and attentiveness that left the household staff exchanging quiet, pleased glances whenever they witnessed it. Mrs. Prentice, in particular, seemed delighted by the transformation, taking to humming softly as she went about her duties, a habit Alara had never once witnessed during her first weeks at the manor. But even as their genuine affection deepened, the threat posed by Lord Harwick had not disappeared, merely retreated temporarily into the shadows while Alara recovered. It was during one of the Duke's rare absences from her bedside, called away briefly to address urgent estate business, that Nora arrived once again at the manor, her expression grave, with news that would soon shatter the fragile peace they had only just begun to build. "There is trouble coming," Nora said, once she had been shown into Alara's chamber, glancing nervously at the door as though fearing to be overheard. "I have heard talk in the village. Lord Harwick has been seen visiting your mother's estate these past weeks. They have been meeting privately, and rumors suggest they are planning something together against you and the Duke." Alara felt the warmth of the past week's happiness cool suddenly, beneath a familiar dread, understanding immediately that whatever peace she had found at Ashgrave Manor was about to be tested by forces determined to see it destroyed entirely. Alara told the Duke of Nora's warning the moment he returned that evening, watching his expression harden into the cold, calculating focus she had first witnessed on the night they met, though now she understood it as armor rather than true coldness, a defense he raised whenever a genuine threat approached. "My cousin and your mother," he said slowly, turning the information over with obvious concern. "It is not a combination I would have predicted, though I suppose their shared grievance against us makes a certain grim sense. Harwick wants my inheritance. Your mother wants, what, precisely? She has already lost whatever leverage she once held over you. Perhaps that is exactly why she would ally with him," Alara said, thinking through her mother's likely motivations with the particular clarity born of 18 years spent studying the woman's every calculation. "If she cannot control me directly any longer, destroying what I have built here would be its own form of satisfaction, and if Harwick offers her money in exchange for whatever help she can provide, she would see little reason to refuse." "What help could she possibly offer him?" the Duke asked. "The marriage itself is legally sound. There is no document, no witness, no legal foundation on which he could challenge its validity." Alara considered this carefully, an uncomfortable realization settling over her as she worked through the possibilities. "Unless," she said slowly, "she claims something happened before our marriage that would invalidate it. A prior arrangement, a promise made to another family. She is skilled at constructing convincing stories, Alistair. I have watched her do it my entire life." The Duke's expression darkened further at this suggestion, understanding the particular danger such fabricated claims might pose, especially if delivered with the practiced conviction Lady Voss had displayed even during her failed confrontation weeks earlier. "We must discover exactly what they intend before they have the chance to act," he said. "I will send inquiries to the village, and to my associates in town, to learn whatever we can of their meetings and their plans." The following days passed in tense anticipation, the warmth that had grown between Alara and the Duke, now tempered by the looming threat of whatever scheme Harwick and Lady Voss were constructing together. Word eventually reached them through one of the Duke's business associates, a man with connections throughout the county's legal circles, that Harwick had been making inquiries regarding an old family friend of the Voss household, a minor gentleman named Edmund Faircliff, to whom Alara had apparently once been informally promised in marriage during her father's lifetime, an arrangement that had quietly dissolved following her father's death and the subsequent decline of the family's fortunes. "I remember him vaguely," Alara said, when the Duke shared this information with her, sitting together in the library, where they now spent most of their evenings. "A distant family friend, though there was never any formal engagement. Only a passing suggestion my father once made when I was still a child. It was never pursued after his death, and I have not seen Edmund Faircliff in over a decade." "That will not matter to your mother and my cousin," the Duke said grimly. "If they can produce Faircliff himself, willing to claim a formal engagement existed and was never properly dissolved. They may attempt to argue our marriage was improperly conducted, that you were bound by prior obligation you failed to disclose. It is a lie, Ilara said, anger rising sharply at the audacity of such a scheme. I do not doubt that, the Duke said. But lies, delivered with enough conviction and enough witnesses willing to support them, have destroyed reputations and fortunes far more secure than ours. We must be prepared to counter whatever claim they intend to bring forward, and we must be prepared to do so publicly, before their version of events takes root in society's imagination. It was Ilara who suggested the solution, born of a sudden memory that surfaced as they discussed the matter further into the evening. There is a housekeeper who served my family for many years before my father's death, she said. Mrs. Aldridge. She retired to a cottage near the village after he passed, but she would remember clearly whether any formal engagement ever existed. My father discussed such matters with her more than with anyone else in the household, given how close she was to our family. Do you believe she would speak on your behalf, against your mother's wishes? The Duke asked. Mrs. Aldridge left our household precisely because she could no longer tolerate how my mother treated me after my father's death, Ilara said, a small, grim smile touching her lips at the memory. I believe she would be more than willing to speak the truth, particularly if it means exposing my mother's current scheme for the fabrication it truly is. The Duke dispatched a carriage the following morning to retrieve Mrs. Aldridge from her cottage, and by afternoon, the elderly woman sat in the manor's drawing room, her sharp eyes taking in the grandeur of her surroundings, with evident satisfaction at seeing her former charge so well settled. No formal engagement ever existed between Miss Ilara and young Master Fairclough, Mrs. Aldridge confirmed firmly, once the situation had been explained to her. Your father mentioned it once, in passing, as a distant possibility should circumstances favor such a match when you came of age. But it was never formalized, never discussed with the Fairclough family directly, and certainly never binding in any legal sense. I would swear to this before any court or gathering that required my testimony. Relief flooded through Ilara at the old housekeeper's firm confirmation, though the Duke's expression remained cautiously alert, understanding that Harwick and Lady Voss might still attempt to present their fabricated claim, regardless of its lack of foundation, trusting in confident delivery to overcome inconvenient truth. We must be prepared regardless, the Duke said, once Mrs. Aldridge had been shown to comfortable quarters for the evening, her testimony secured for whatever confrontation lay ahead. If they intend to bring this claim forward publicly, we should ensure we are the ones who control when and how the truth is revealed, rather than allowing them to catch us unprepared. Ilara nodded, steeling herself for whatever confrontation was still to come, grateful beyond measure that she no longer faced such battles alone, as she once had within the cold walls of her mother's household. Whatever scheme Harwick and Lady Voss had constructed together, she found herself determined to meet it not with fear, but with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through that freezing night months earlier, when a stranger's carriage had first opened its door and offered her a path toward the life she now fought so fiercely to protect. The confrontation Harwick and Lady Voss had been building toward finally arrived at the county's largest social gathering of the season, a grand ball hosted by the Marquis of Bellwether, attended by nearly every family of consequence within a 50-mile radius. Ilara had known, from the moment the invitation arrived, that Harwick would likely choose such a public setting for whatever accusation he intended to bring forward, understanding as she did the value he placed on maximum humiliation delivered before the widest possible audience. She entered the ballroom that evening on the Duke's arm, dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Mrs. Prentice had insisted suited her perfectly, her composure carefully maintained despite the anxiety coiling tightly in her stomach. The Duke's hand rested reassuringly over hers, where it lay on his arm, a silent promise of support that steadied her nerves more than any words could have managed. They had barely completed their first circuit of the room, exchanging polite greetings with various acquaintances, when Lord Harwick appeared before them, flanked by a nervous-looking gentleman Ilara recognized, after a moment's confusion, as an older, heavier version of the boy she vaguely remembered from her childhood, Edmund Fairclough himself, looking distinctly uncomfortable with whatever role he had been persuaded or paid to play that evening. "Cousin," Harwick said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, exactly as Ilara had suspected he intended. How fortunate to find you both here tonight. I have brought someone who I believe has a matter of some importance to discuss regarding your marriage." The Duke's expression remained carefully composed, though Alara felt his arm tense beneath her hand. "If you have concerns regarding my marriage, Harwick, I suggest you raise them through proper legal channels rather than theatrical displays at a social gathering." "Oh, but this concerns everyone here, does it not?" Harwick said, his voice rising slightly, drawing further attention from the surrounding crowd. Several conversations nearby already trailing off, as curious guests turned to observe the unfolding confrontation. "It concerns the very legitimacy of a marriage conducted with such unusual haste. Mr. Fairclough, would you care to explain to the assembled company the nature of your prior arrangement with the former Miss Whitmore?" Edmund Fairclough shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to be thrust into the center of such public attention, though whatever arrangement had been made with Harwick apparently compelled him to speak regardless. That is, there was an understanding, some years ago, between our families," he said, his voice lacking any real conviction, "regarding a possible future match between myself and Miss Whitmore." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd, exactly the reaction Harwick had clearly hoped to provoke. Alara felt her heart pounding, but kept her expression composed, waiting for the moment she and the Duke had carefully prepared for during the tense days leading up to this evening. "An understanding," the Duke repeated evenly, his voice carrying clearly across the now attentive ballroom. "And was this understanding ever formalized? Was any contract signed? Any official engagement announced? Any dowry discussed between your families?" Fairclough hesitated, glancing nervously toward Harwick before answering. "No formal contract, no. But my father and Miss Whitmore's father discussed the possibility on several occasions, and discussions between fathers regarding a possible future match, made when their children were still barely more than children themselves, hold no legal weight whatsoever," the Duke interrupted, his voice cutting cleanly through Fairclough's faltering explanation. "I suspect you know this as well as I do, Mr. Fairclough, which raises the question of why my cousin has persuaded you to raise such a matter publicly, rather than through any legitimate legal proceeding." Harwick's confident expression flickered slightly at this direct challenge, though he pressed forward regardless. "The legitimacy of such discussions is precisely the matter that requires clarification, cousin. If Miss Whitmore concealed a prior understanding from you before your marriage, it raises serious questions about—" "There was no concealment," Alara said, finding her voice at last, steady and clear despite the many eyes now fixed upon her. "I have brought someone tonight who can speak with far greater authority than Mr. Fairclough regarding the truth of this matter." She gestured toward the ballroom's entrance, where Mrs. Aldridge, dressed in her finest gown for the occasion, stepped forward from where she had been waiting discreetly at the Duke's arrangement. Recognition flickered across several faces in the crowd, older families who remembered the woman's long years of service to the Whitmore household before its decline. "Mrs. Aldridge served my family for over 20 years, Alara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She was present for every significant conversation held within our household during my father's lifetime. I would ask her now to speak plainly regarding whether any formal engagement ever existed between myself and Mr. Fairclough." Mrs. Aldridge stepped forward with the calm dignity of a woman entirely unintimidated by grand surroundings or gathered nobility. "No such engagement ever existed," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "Master Whitmore mentioned the possibility once, in idle conversation, as young Miss Alara had not yet reached her 10th year. It was never discussed again, never pursued with the Fairclough family directly, and certainly never constituted any binding arrangement. I find it curious, and rather troubling, that such an old and forgotten conversation should suddenly be presented as fact all these years later, particularly by those who stand to benefit most from casting doubt upon a marriage they clearly wish to see dissolved." The final observation landed with visible impact, several guests turning their attention now toward Harwick, with expressions shifting from curiosity to open suspicion. Lady Voss, who had been standing near Harwick throughout the confrontation, her presence unremarked upon until this moment, suddenly found herself the subject of curious, judging glances as guests began piecing together her involvement in the scheme. "Lady Voss," the Duke said, turning his attention deliberately toward Alara's mother, his voice carrying the same cold precision Alara had first witnessed on the night they met. Perhaps you would care to explain your own role in bringing forward such a baseless claim against your own daughter's marriage. I understand you have been meeting privately with my cousin these past weeks. Lady Voss's composed mask, so carefully maintained throughout the evening, finally began to crack under the weight of so many curious eyes turning toward her. I merely wish to ensure my daughter's welfare, she said, though her voice lacked its usual practiced confidence. As any mother would. As any mother would, Elara repeated quietly, though her voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear the bitter edge beneath her words. The same mother who struck me in front of an entire household and threw me into the freezing night with nothing but the clothes on my back. Forgive me if I find your sudden concern for my welfare difficult to believe, particularly when it arrives conveniently paired with Lord Harwick's own financial interest in seeing my marriage dissolved. The crowd's murmurs grew louder now, whispers spreading rapidly through the ballroom as the true nature of the scheme became clear to everyone present. Harwick's confident expression had entirely collapsed, replaced by the visible panic of a man watching his carefully constructed plan unravel in front of the very audience he had hoped would validate it. "This is preposterous," Harwick said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. "I sought only to protect the family's legitimate interests regarding my uncle's estate. You sought to protect your own inheritance, Harwick, by any means necessary, including conspiring with a woman known throughout this county for her cruelty toward her own daughter," the Duke said, his voice final and unyielding. "I trust everyone present tonight now understands clearly the nature of both your claim and its origin. I would suggest you consider carefully whether you wish to pursue this matter further, through legitimate legal channels, understanding that any such attempt will only expose your scheme more thoroughly than tonight's gathering already has." Harwick opened his mouth as though to offer some further defense, but seemed to think better of it under the weight of so many disapproving stares now fixed upon him. He turned instead and departed the ballroom with as much remaining dignity as he could muster, Faircliff trailing uncomfortably behind him, clearly relieved to escape further public scrutiny. Lady Voss remained a moment longer, her eyes meeting Elara's across the small distance still separating them. For just a moment, something almost like genuine regret flickered across her features, quickly suppressed beneath her usual composed mask. "I hope you are satisfied," she said quietly, though whether the words carried bitterness or something closer to grudging acknowledgement, Elara could not entirely tell. "I am satisfied that the truth has finally been spoken plainly, in front of everyone who matters," Elara replied evenly, "something I waited 18 years to witness within our own household, and never once received." Lady Voss said nothing further, turning instead to follow Harwick's retreat from the ballroom. Her departure met with cold, judging silence from the assembled guests who had witnessed her scheme laid bare. As the doors closed behind her, the tension that had gripped the room began to ease, conversation gradually resuming around them, though Elara suspected the evening's events would be discussed throughout the county for weeks to come. The Duke turned to her once the immediate crowd had begun to disperse, his gray eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like pride. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed myself," he said quietly. "I had excellent support," Elara replied, squeezing his arm gently. "I do not believe I could have faced them alone." "You will never have to," the Duke said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that settled deep into her chest, warming her far more thoroughly than any fire ever could. "Whatever comes next, Elara, you face it with me beside you, exactly as it should be." In the weeks following the ball, the county's opinion of Lord Harwick and Lady Voss shifted decisively against them both, the story of their failed scheme spreading through drawing rooms and correspondence far faster than either could hope to counter. Harwick's business associates, unwilling to align themselves with a man now widely regarded as a schemer, willing to fabricate claims for personal gain, began quietly withdrawing their support, and within a month, word reached Ashgrave Manor that he had retreated entirely from local society, his ambitions toward the family inheritance finally and thoroughly extinguished. Lady Voss's fate proved similarly diminished, though Elara found she took little satisfaction in her mother's decline, the old wounds too complicated to resolve simply through witnessing another's downfall. Invitations to the Voss household grew sparse as the county's families, having witnessed firsthand the cruelty and manipulation Lady Voss was capable of, quietly distanced themselves from further association. Celeste's engagement to Julian Ashworth, already strained by the family's financial difficulties, dissolved entirely within weeks, the Ashworth family unwilling to connect themselves further with a household now marked by public scandal. Alara heard of these developments through occasional letters from Nora, who remained in contact despite having eventually left the Voss household herself for a position with a kinder family nearby. She read of her mother's increasing isolation with a complicated mixture of feelings. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret, but something closer to the quiet acknowledgement that consequences, however delayed, had finally arrived for choices made long ago. "Do you think she will ever understand what she did wrong?" Alara asked the Duke one evening, several months after the ball, as they sat together in the library that had become their favorite refuge within the vast manor. "Some people are never capable of such understanding," the Duke said thoughtfully, setting aside the letter he had been reading regarding estate business. "Your mother built her entire sense of self around control and appearance. Losing both, as she has, may in time teach her something of humility, or it may simply harden whatever bitterness already existed within her. I do not believe that outcome is yours to determine, Alara. Nor should her failure to change diminish anything you have built here despite everything she did to you." Alara considered his words carefully, finding comfort in their quiet wisdom, so different from the cold, guarded man who had first offered her a practical arrangement on a dark winter road. In the months since their marriage, that man had gradually revealed himself to be someone far warmer than his careful reputation suggested, someone capable of deep loyalty and genuine tenderness once trust had finally been earned. "I find I do not need her understanding any longer," Alara said finally, and realized, as she spoke the words, that they carried the full weight of truth rather than mere hopeful sentiment. "I have built something here that matters far more than anything I lost within her household." The Duke reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking her hand with the same gentle warmth that had become so familiar over the months of their growing partnership. "As have I," he said quietly. "I did not expect, when I offered you that carriage seat on a cold road, that I would find myself so thoroughly changed by the arrangement. I came to you guarded against ever trusting anyone again, and you have taught me, slowly and patiently, that such guarding was never truly protecting me from anything worth avoiding." Alara smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at his words, so far removed from the cold formality that had once defined every conversation between them. "I believe we changed each other," she said. "I arrived here believing myself unworthy of anything beyond mere survival, grateful simply for shelter and safety. You have taught me that I deserve far more than survival alone." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the library door, and Mrs. Prentice entered with the particular pleased expression she had worn increasingly often throughout the household's recent months of happiness. "Forgive the interruption, Your Graces," she said, "but a letter has arrived that I believed you would wish to see immediately." The Duke took the offered letter, his brow furrowing slightly as he broke the seal and began reading, an expression of surprise gradually crossing his features as he absorbed its contents. "It is from the Crown's estate office," he said, looking up at Alara with something close to wonder in his gray eyes. "My father's original will contained a secondary provision I had entirely forgotten, given how thoroughly the inheritance clause overshadowed everything else within it. Should the marriage prove genuine and lasting beyond a full year, an additional trust established for my father's grandchildren becomes accessible, one significant enough to secure the estate's future for generations to come. Your father anticipated this," Alara said softly, understanding immediately the deeper meaning behind such careful legal planning. "He wished to reward not merely a marriage of convenience, but genuine devotion. It seems he understood something about love and partnership that I had forgotten entirely, after everything Isabel's betrayal cost me," the Duke said, setting the letter aside and reaching for Alara's hand once more. "I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that circumstances brought us together on that road, however difficult the path that led us there." Alara thought back, in that quiet moment, to the freezing night that had begun this entire journey, her mother's raised hand, the bolt sliding shut behind her, the long, uncertain walk down an empty road with nowhere to turn. She thought of the carriage door opening, of a cold, guarded stranger, offering her shelter and safety, in exchange for nothing more than her presence and her honesty. She had walked away from cruelty that night, believing she was simply escaping into an uncertain future, never imagining that uncertain future would eventually become a genuine home, filled with warmth and partnership she had never dared hope to find. A year later, on the anniversary of the night they first met, The Duke arranged a quiet celebration within the manor's grounds, gathering the household staff, who had watched their arrangement gradually transform into genuine devotion, along with the small circle of friends who had remained loyal throughout the difficulties of the previous months. Nora attended, delighted to witness firsthand the happiness her friend had built for herself against such difficult odds, and even Mrs. Aldridge made the journey from her cottage to join the celebration, proud of the role she had played in defending Alara's marriage against those who had sought to destroy it. Standing together in the manor's gardens, as evening settled softly around them, the Duke turned to Alara with an expression far removed from the cold, unreadable composure he had worn on the night they first met. I have thought often, these past months, about what might have happened had I not chosen to stop that carriage, he said quietly. Had I simply continued past you on that road, believing it none of my concern. Then I suppose we would both have missed out on something rather remarkable, Alara said, smiling as she reached for his hand. Something remarkable indeed, the Duke agreed, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture of quiet, genuine devotion. I am endlessly grateful, Alara, that some part of me recognized, even in that first cold moment, that stopping for you was the beginning of something far greater than either of us could have imagined. Alara looked out across the gardens, at the warm lights glowing from the manor's many windows, at the small gathering of people who had become, over the course of a single remarkable year, something closer to family than she had known since her father's death so many years before. She thought of the frightened, beaten young woman who had once walked alone down a dark, freezing road, believing herself abandoned by everyone who should have loved her, and found herself filled with quiet gratitude for every difficult step that had led her, eventually, to this moment. She was no longer the forgotten, mistreated daughter cast out into the cold by her own mother's cruelty. She was the Duchess of Ashgrave, standing beside a man who had chosen her not out of mere practical necessity, but out of genuine, hard-earned love, in a home filled at last with the warmth and belonging she had feared, on that terrible night, she might never find again. The carriage door that had opened on that dark road so long ago had led her, in the end, exactly where she was always meant to be.